and the building's walls just come to drape it like a screen or like a curtain, and they are hung upon the frame, which is the load bearing thing, mainly to seal the building's interior from the elements of weather. In other words, the metal frame is the building's skeleton while the walls form its skin. The skyscraper was the great technical achievement of the Chicago school. Yet the school is also responsible for a great aesthetic achievement, the gradual reduction of traditional ornamentation in skyscraper design. The guarantee building that we saw earlier was still having a lot of ornamentation to it, but the building that you see to the right is actually now getting devoid, slowly and slowly devoid of ornamentation. It is rather lending itself to height, to an entirely new building type, and the traditional aesthetics are unsatisfactory. So the machine aesthetic is required for this new kind of architecture, and this is going to accelerate the development of the modern aesthetic, which means that modern buildings cannot rely on the traditional aesthetics. They need a modern aesthetics to match themselves, right? The transition away from traditional ornamentation culminated in the development of functionalism by Louis Sullivan, and he said that function must predominate the form of the building. So the simple geometry is very important, and here his guiding principle of form follows function again comes into being. He is also called the father of modern architecture, and his masterpiece is the Wainwright Building on your right. The exterior of the building reflects its three-part internal plan and a brick pier indicating columns in the steel frame. The horizontal dividers that you see, these horizontal intricate frieze work, the bullseye windows, it's actually just a skin over the metal frame that is actually holding the building together. And there's a lot of stucco decoration that is taking place, which we'll find will gradually disappear because the modern aesthetic needs a different kind of ornamentation altogether. Now, in the meantime, a rival aesthetic, local rival aesthetics also developed, and one of these was called the Art Nouveau. The Art Nouveau was a style that flourished in Europe and America at the turn of the century. Like functionalism, Art Nouveau was purposely developed as an all-new aesthetic free of traditional ornamentation, yet it was exuberantly decorative. And Art Nouveau also found its way into the interior design of buildings, not just the exteriors but the interiors. And it was largely organic, curving, asymmetrical lines inspired by natural forms like stems, the curves, leaves, flowers, insect wings, and you name it. So all organic forms were coming into play when we talked about ornamentation within the Art Nouveau style. Because it again became a time of peace, so people were beginning to experiment. So even the balconies and the balustrades and the railings that were there, they had this voluptuous curve kind of effect to itself. And who was the most overt architectural expression of art in the growing buildings of? The architect Antonio Gaudí. His masterpiece is the Sagrada Familia, a cathedral in Barcelona. But see, look at the overt style. I mean, it is almost like a growing building. It's a building that continues to grow. And the second example is that of Casa Milà. This is an interior of the Sagrada. So even the interiors seem to be absolutely flowing with organic forms, that are actually the building is growing, the architecture is growing as the building is growing, right? Another form that came up during the same time is the Art Deco. What was the Art Deco? During the period 1920 to 40, which is really the interwar period, another short-lived rival to mainstream modernism flourished, which was the Art Deco. Like the modern aesthetic, Art Deco shuns traditional decoration. So Art Deco is very contrary to Art Nouveau. And it talks about minimalism, and it also works on typically heavy and contrived architecture. Distinctive features of Art Nouveau included setbacks, which really meant the building as it rose. If you look at the building on the right, the Chrysler Tower. The Chrysler Tower, The building continues as a cuboid to a certain height, after which it develops certain setbacks, and finally there is a pinnacle at the top. So, inward steps, narrow windows, strips of concrete, giving the building a sense of heavy construction. Although Art Deco was primarily a French style, it culminated architecturally in the United States. So, all these examples, the GE building, the Empire State and the Chrysler, are examples from New York City, from Chicago, and the foremost examples are found as you can see in these slides. And this is a famous GE building across a forecourt, the famous Rockefeller Center. Now, another thing about these buildings is that because there were very tight spaces between the buildings and the buildings had to go very much high, vertical, they had to naturally have setbacks at the top for reasons of light, ventilation and sunlight pouring into the lower areas. So, the setback, so that's where the first genesis of our bylaws come into being. The buildings had also to be protected from fire. So, fire safety was also. So, the first zoning ordinance of New York City actually came back way in 1880s because the fire department had a problem trying to evacuate people from such high-rise buildings. So, they developed the setback building and the zoning ordinance, which said that the higher you go, the more setback you have to have, because these setbacks then actually serve as refuge terraces or escape routes for the firemen to bring people to lower floors for safety and then gradually evacuate them out of the building. The late modern architecture. Let's talk a bit about what was the late modern. In the early 20th century, the modern aesthetic, the simple, unadorned geometric forms finally matured, becoming the mainstream aesthetic of architecture and design across the world. Now, who was behind this modern aesthetic? It was achieved primarily by the Bauhaus, a German school of design that operated for most of the interwar period. Unfortunately, the school was closed down because the Nazi government came to power, and many of its scholars were forced to emigrate to the United States, Europe, and other parts of South Europe, where they continued to serve as leaders of the architecture design world, and the Bauhaus age actually stretched decades beyond the closure of the school. So, in a way, the Nazi movement proved very productive for the development of the Bauhaus architectural style beyond the borders of Germany. The Bauhaus Architectural School was founded by Walter Gropius, and the scope of the Bauhaus School did not limit itself to just the exteriors. As we saw in the previous slide, it also included interiors, it talked about furniture, it talked about accessories, it talks about finishes, it also talks about how to make the interiors look as modern aesthetics as the exteriors are. The scope of Bauhaus efforts included architecture, visual art, interior design, graphic design and industrial design, which is product design. And it is to be noted that Bauhaus designers generally embrace the aesthetic theory of functionalism. Deliberate use of this theory is not a prerequisite to designing works that feature the modern aesthetic. Thus, for any given modern style building or object, the designer may or may not have had functionalism in mind. But definitely, it was talking about functionalism at the back of the Bauhaus. The modern aesthetic reached maturity when excess material, including traditional ornamentation, had been stripped away, leaving only a basic structure of plain geometric forms, which one relates to the concept of minimalism, that you have only as much as you need. As noted above, this maturation was achieved in the early 20th century, with Bauhaus leading the way, both in terms of innovation and propagation. Architecture that features the major mature modern aesthetic is known as the International Style of Architecture due to the rapid global diffusion of this style once it emerged. The International Style of Architecture should not be confused with globalism, because the international style insisted upon responding to the local context, the use of local materials, of course the use of technology, which was a technology transfer means, but it never advocated anything that could be transported long distances or that was hybrid to the context of the site. We'll talk about the international style of architecture in the slides that follow. The three most influential pioneers of the international style were Walter Gropius, Le Corbusier, Mies van der Rohe. Walter Gropius was the first director of the School of Architecture of Bauhaus. He designed the buildings of the school's second campus, which you can see on the slide above. The picture on the left is the exterior and the picture on the right is the interior of one of the studios. Basically plain walls, large screens of glass to bring in natural light, sometimes several stories in height predominate the building. The balconies showcase an impressive new structural possibility of steel frame construction. So there is a lightweightedness of the building. It's not something which is very ornate, it's not something. It's almost signifying an airy, light, airy architecture. The clean, smooth lines, the honesty and the truthfulness of building material, and the reflection of the skin versus the frame of the building. Cantilevers, platforms fixed only at one end further contributes to a sense of architectural weightlessness. The interiors again are also very light, very functional, a lot of use of glass to bring in natural light, and an honesty of material and expression is what one sees in the international style. Another proponent of the international style and one of the most famous architects of the modern era, Le Corbusier. He is a Swiss architect, though not a so-called member of the Bauhaus, yet he was absorbed and he became a leading figure of the international style. He preferred the smooth expanses of white reinforced concrete pierced with horizontal strip windows as well as a degree of curvilinear geometry. Le Corbusier's masterpiece is the Villa Savoye. This is the Villa Savoye in Poissy, France, Paris. Here one finds that the 5 points of architecture that Corbusier was always trying to be an exponent of are fully reflected in this building. The ribbon windows, as you see, the roof garden, which is on top because he wanted to leave the ground completely free, a floating feeling by using the pilotis. So the ground floor is almost like it's a darkened inset floor and the upper floor seems to be floating, and these are the columns which he calls the pilotis. The free plan, which means there's just very little inside the building that can be said to be fixed. Everything else is movable. I mean, the walls can be modified. So actually the structure of the load of this is actually being taken by these pilotis, and inside is a completely free plan. So there's a lot of flexibility that can happen here. And then we have the free facade, which means actually there is nothing to hold this facade or to block it or to do anything. The roof garden, the pilotis, the free plan, the free facade and the ribbon window are the 5 points of the international style propagated by the proponent Le Corbusier. What you see here is his love for concrete and the curvilinear geometry, the Ronchamp, a chapel, and here what you see is his multi-family housing within a single building, the Unity habitation. Okay. More examples of the international style. As you can see, the cuboidal form, the honesty of architecture and the simplicity of form is emerging here again and again. And while Gropius and Le Corbusier made ample use of reinforced concrete, pure glass and steel construction in the international style was perfected by Mies van der Rohe, another director of the Bauhaus, who believed so firmly in eliminating all embellishment that his guiding principle simply became less is more. Mies brought the international style to the height of its influence as descendants of his glass and steel skyscrapers appeared in every corner of the globe. The Seagram Building Center in New York, essentially a steel-framed sheathed in curtains of glass, is often considered his masterpiece, and on the right is the Lakeshore Drive apartments in Chicago, also a masterpiece of steel and glass. The Rohe House by Frank Lloyd Wright also marks a great achievement in organic architecture, a relatively complex asymmetrical plan, but actually a mixture of building materials brought in with the organic style. More examples of the organic architecture by Frank Lloyd Wright, in which he wants his buildings to merge with nature, is the Falling Water, the Bear Run at Pennsylvania. Last but not the least, after the international style, we come to buildings which are talking more about the postmodern architecture. And here I'll just mention two examples. The Sydney Opera House is a very important one, and the AT&T building. I mean, basically postmodern architecture beyond the observation that anything can go. Nonetheless, postmodern architecture does exhibit a range of common features such as the complex geometry including curvilinear stuff, more postmodern buildings. The one opposite the London's Eye, the Gherkin building next to the River Thames, talks about high-tech or space age architecture. Thank you very much for your patience.